you heard the intro for this thing?
No.
It's hilarious.
Is it?
It's a little throwback to his punk rock days. Got a quote from David Cook. Dennis, if you need help with substance abuse, you can call me anytime.
I'm Arizona Family political editor Dennis Welch.
Dennis, fake news Welch. Try to tell the truth.
And this is the Politics Unplugged podcast.
Dennis, if you have a problem with substance abuse, I am more than willing to talk to you anytime you need.
Thank you for joining the podcast here. I got to say, it's kind of embarrassing how much stuff we have to go through this week. I mean, we've got an entire legislative session, a record session, 204 days, 143 vetoes. And, you know, I'm joined by a couple of guys who are just experts, have been down at the legislature for a very long time. We've got Mike Haener, who served under Napolitano, currently has been an advisor for Governor Hobbs. And we got Marcus Dell'Artino, longtime consultant, Republican, and all that good stuff. So
Every time you say long time, all I can think of is how old I'm getting.
It's the diplomatic way of saying that we're all getting a little bit older.
Well, and I knew Marcus when he had the beard wasn't gray, so.
You did. You knew me before kids.
I also remember Marcus. I remember Marcus with the mullet too. Remember?
That's a true story. I'm not even going to deny it. There's too much evidence.
The Marcus mullet. I remember that.
Thanks for the reminder.
Okay, so shifting from mullets back to the legislature. I know it's a hard shift, but let's. I want to start with just get the general takeaways. I want to start with you, Mike. You've been down there for a lot of these. Again, we were talking just before we started rolling here. 204 days, 143, vetoes. What's the big takeaway from the legislature this year?
That they finished. that they got the budget done. They did some big things with the transportation tax, the Prop 400 extension, the rental tax repeal. But they did some big things. They got the budget done, and they went home, finally.
Well, that sounds like a very kind of Republican answer. All the Republican governors would always say, that's the big thing I got done is the budget. And then they would talk about tax cuts. Like, Marcus, I've heard the criticism from some Democrats about the governor's budget that it looks more like the Republican majority out there. Do you think the governor did a good job getting this budget done? It was $18 billion, near $18 billion state spending plan. It did include some tax cuts, and at the end we got the rental tax through. We got the tax rebate for the kids. For Arizona parents, it was $250 per kid.
You missed out on that one, Haener. I'm cashing in, baby.
So I mean, really, when you look at that, was this a more Democrat or Republican friendly kind of budget, or do you think this was legit compromise?
I think of course the Republicans are going to say it's a more Republican budget. I've heard this from Democrats. My Republican lens says it's more of a Republican budget. I do not expect that to take place next budget or the budget thereafter. I think to some extent we lost a little perspective on what happened, come January 1, right? Mm-hmm. The governor won, to some extent, somewhat of a surprise. I think people in the media and large S were sort of saying Arizona's a Republican state, so the Republican will win. That did not occur. Mm-hmm. And so very quickly she had to get staffed up. And let's be honest, there is not a plethora of Democrats that are policy rich, ready to go up onto the 9th floor. So you've got a feat in that alone, number one. Two, you've got an inauguration to plan for, which is a giant undertaking. Mm-hmm. And then you go right into, within days, right into State of the State speech, which is a massive policy development speech, and then you're into budget. So there was a lot of things crammed in really quickly for this governor to sort of digest and get up on her feet. So that being said, I think that, I think the budget leans a little Republican, certainly a tax cut for every Arizonan with kids, regardless of income, was something that the Republicans wanted. The rental tax, there's a number of things I think contained within that budget. But I don't expect that luxury next session for two reasons. One is I think they're going to be more aptly staffed up, policy ready to go. But two, we also do not have the largesse of money that we had this session. So,
the one other thing that I'll add, though, the governor did get a historic investment in housing and homeless issues. In this,
it was $150 million in the housing trust fund.
Correct. And so again, there are some things that lean Republican, there are some things that lean Democratic, and that's where we should end up most years is with a center-based budget. Nobody is happy. Nobody gets everything they want because you have to compromise.
Well, let's start with ask you about first of all, the tax rebate, the $250 for parents per child, regardless of income. Should that have been regardless of income? Should there have been maybe this had been geared more towards low-income families?
Well, again, I think that the challenge that we all have in Monday morning quarterbacking these types of decisions is
we love Monday morning quarterbacking here.
Exactly, but we're not in the room.
Yeah.
So we're not part of that discussion about how all of this comes together. And there are multiple different pieces of, again, I'll accept that if you accept this. And so a lot of times, again, maybe you think that wasn't the best way to do it, but you're not in the room making those decisions in real time. And so again, I think that the budget overall is a good balance between the Republican side and the Democratic side to try and get Arizonans where they need to be, which is growing the middle class, creating more opportunity for job creation and job growth, and that's ultimately what you want to look for.
Okay,
I would say this to Mike's point in that when you're doing this negotiation, I was surprised, frankly, that there wasn't an income limit on it, right? Especially for a governor and a caucus that advocates for an income limit on ESAs, right? So to that, there was a little conflict in messaging there. I guess I'd put it there. But I would say when you're in the room and you're having that negotiation, you're realizing it's one-time money. This wasn't an ongoing expense. And I think that played a major part in the decision-making on that particular piece of policy.
And Mark, I want to stick with you. Let's talk a little bit about the rental tax. Is this really going to help renters? It doesn't take effect until 2025. And I had just interviewed the governor earlier this week, asked her what kind of enforcement mechanism, how are they going to make sure that this is enforced? And all I could get from her was an answer is like, well, we're going to make sure it's enforced. Nothing specific in that. And if you look at the legislation, it's unclear how they're going to make sure that landlords pass the savings on to the renters.
Yeah, I think I don't think we're going to know until we have some evidence that sort of points that out, number one.
Yeah, because the governor initially vetoed a similar bill like this, and she called it a tax cut for landlords.
And I think that there's a legitimate argument to say that. There's a bunch of landlords that we just know are not going to pass that savings on, number one. Number two is, I think we're getting into this pattern of making policy that's based on a headline rather than a policy that's good policy. And I keep coming back to we wanted to do a tax cut on feminine hygiene products. And, I did some research on it, and I did some math and calculated it out, and it came down to a penny per feminine hygiene product. And I just have a tough time imagining that 1 penny per feminine hygiene product makes an actual difference in somebody's life, that actually a choice is made that I will buy or I won't buy that product based on I got 1 cent. And so some of these taxes, especially centered around tax policies, the money that taxpayers are getting back is somewhat insignificant, and the policy is more about saying I gave you a tax cut rather than I gave you a real tax cut that makes a policy change.
Do you agree with that? About what Marcus is saying, that this is being driven by headlines instead of good policy?
Well, I think most things that happen in the political world today are driven by headlines and anecdotes, not real policy of what works. Again, for the most part, that's how you get reelected is by saying, I cut your taxes, I did this, I did that. Whether it's good policy or not, that's what politicians do.
Just looking for that bullet point to tell the tell the constituents on the stump when you're out there campaigning.
Right.
Let's shift now a little bit. Talk about the vetoes. Mike, you were in Napolitano's office when she set a record for the number of vetoes in 1 year. It was, 58 or something like that?
It was 58, yes.
So, Governor Hobbs seems like
he has that tattooed somewhere on his body.
I mean, that's like such a quaint number now when you consider the 143 vetoes with that Hobbs did this year. I mean, she warned the legislature at the start of the session. It's like, don't send me, conspiracy-based bills or bills that are based in conspiracy or agenda-based, and they did anyway. Give us a sense of your take on what, those types of bills, what they would have done for the state had there been a governor willing to sign them.
Nothing. They wouldn't have done anything other than enhance the culture war. That's all those are for. Again, those are.
The election bills would have been.
They would have made it harder for people to vote, right? And is that what we want? I don't think so. I think we want to make sure that everybody that can vote or is eligible to vote does vote, and not put barriers in the way of voting. But again, the gender-based bills, the other ones that were sent up just to get her on the record when she's already on the record, it makes no sense. They're not going to pass. They're not going to become law. So why do it? Again, it's because I can then go on the stump and say, I passed this. She vetoed it.
Well, we were just talking a second ago about headlines driving policy. I mean, my sense was, correct me if I'm wrong or prove me that I'm wrong, was a lot of these bills were for fundraising. They would send this stuff to the governor, and then all of a sudden you get a fundraising email, a day later.
I'd use a little more broader term than just concentrating on fundraising, but to Mike's point, I would say they appeal to the base, which is probably code for it's a good fundraiser.
Right. Yeah. Distinction without a difference.
For people who've been doing this for more than a couple yeys, I would say it is absolutely not shocking how many vetoes were. And as a matter of fact, there were office pools around. Is
that legal? Can you get on DraftKings and go over under on the number of vetoes?
Not on DraftKings. But I don't know.
It's more of a fantasy sport. So.
I don't know anybody who was under 100. I was at 140. I will tell you, and I barely missed out on the money.
I want documentation on that.
Well, and again, but when you start off the session with, we're going to do a budget with Republican-only votes when we have a one-vote majority without ever talking to the governor, and you send up whatever it is, 16, 17, 18 budget bills, you're on the way to 143 vetoes.
Yeah, and I think to a large extent, I think the argument could be made that she did win this election, and people put her in place to do what she did with the vetoes, to stop bad legislation from moving forward. But moving ahead, the governor's got to get more, point to bigger victories. Correct?
Well, first of all, I agree with you, and I think what's partially lost in this discussion is it really didn't. The Democrats that voted for Katie Hobbs, and there were Republicans that voted for Carrie Lake, but the people that made the difference were the independents. And I think that those independents, partially in the back of their mind, were thinking, I want a divided government. I want a check and balance in my system. And, they made the difference in the election, and they got what they wanted, whether Republicans like it or not, and whether Democrats like it or not.
Yeah. And I do think that, again, legislatively, it's difficult to get stuff done as a Democratic governor with a Republican majority, right? So you've got to focus on getting things done in the budget, making deals as part of the budget. But if you look at what the governor has done since, the first spring break, maybe the second spring break of the legislature.
There were a lot of breaks.
There were a lot of breaks. But if you look at what she's done, she's traveled to the border. She's giving out money for law enforcement related to border issues. She's going up and dealing with issues related to water. There are a lot of things that she can do from an administrative executive standpoint. Again, whether it's an executive order, whether it's just executive action using federal dollars and other things, repurposing money that was part of one of the federal ARPA or the Investment Jobs Act. So looking at the way she's actually doing those types of things are going to be victories in the long run. Again, water, the border, jobs, economic development, growing the middle class.
Something that she's going to have to address, though, is the state school voucher program. Correct. I mean, when she got Governor Hobbs, revealed her budget at the beginning of the year. It was estimated that in her budget that she was going to save $1.5 billion over 10 years by repealing the ESA program. But now the latest forecasts are pegging the annual cost of this program at $1 billion. That is the governor's forecast, and that is their Department of Education's forecast. Now, I talked to the governor earlier this week again, and asked her why she couldn't get more done to curb the explosive growth of this program. She said, well, it's just something that Republicans, it was a non-starter. And Mike, I want to tap your experience. You did work with Napolitano, and you were known as somebody who would go down there and could put pressure on folks, to bring, to vote one way or the other or get stuff done. Is there something more the governor could have done to get leverage to force Republicans to consider or hear ways to curtail this program?
Again, it goes back to that negotiating with folks in a room. So if you're not in that room, it's hard to know what was talked about and how it was talked about and what other things that they've tried to do.
Sure.
Again, it's the governor alone isn't going to be able to solve $1 billion hole in the budget because of ESAs. And again, the money's not coming from the state. This is new money that we're talking about because these people aren't leaving public schools and going to private schools. They're in private schools now getting this money. So again, the question becomes, how do you work together? If this were any other program, any other project, any other thing that was in the legislature that was estimated to be about $30 million and is now $1 billion, if this were alt fuels going back 20 some years, the legislature and the governor would have worked together to solve it. The Republicans don't want to solve. They don't think this is a problem and don't want to solve it. They want people leaving the public schools to go to private schools.
Mm-hmm. And the governor's forecast was it over $300 million hole in the budget they just agreed upon because of the explosive growth of this ESA program. I don't see the Republicans moving forward next year and giving an inch on any of this.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me go back to one of your statements because you talked about Mike going down to the legislature when he worked for the governor. And let me just tell you.
Look, he had a reputation, man. I want to be clear. Mike's a very nice guy, but I would hear these stories that he could play some hardball.
You asked for documentation on something that Marcus said earlier. I'm looking for documentation on that.
I will. Next week, I'll bring on witnesses.
It was a different place and time, though. I think you would agree with that.
Yes.
I know I would, and I think you would. That the way things worked and policy was made was vastly different than it is now, number one. Number two is the governor can't just wave a magic wand. It's not like she can do an EO tomorrow, executive order tomorrow, saying here's what we're going to do on ESAs, right? So for people to come after her and say you didn't do anything completely leaves out an entire peg of government, which is called the Arizona legislature.
She signed the budget in May. Couldn't she have held out on that while trying to get concessions on the ESA?
I think the Republicans, Ben Toma has been nothing but clear on this point. We are not discussing ESAs. Right. So, what I ultimately expect to happen from this is that there will be an initiative or referendum initiative, I guess I should say, on the ballot that the voters are going to have to decide. But I would caution Republicans that, I would say we need to do something because the guy who gets the most liability on this at the end of the day is Tom Horn. Because regardless of whether he had anything to do with it or not, he is a superintendent of public instruction, and most voters just look at that and think he has everything possibly to do with education policy. You and I know different,
right?
And you know different, but most voters don't.
Well, a referendum type, you said, on ESAs?
Yeah.
I'm old enough to remember, I think we did that. The voters rejected that. And then Governor Ducey just said, what the hell? Let's expand it.
I think if we continually, and I expect the governor to be beating this drum far and wide for the next year or so. Mm-hmm. And I think once that sort of happens, and we talk about the numbers, Republicans would be smart to get ahead of the curve, I guess is what I would say.
In moving forward, what do you see, Mike, the unfinished business from this governor? I mean, we just talked about ESAs. Obviously, she's going to be focused on that. You can't ignore that issue. What is she going to be doing next year? And do you think it'll be a different tactic that the governor is going to be using to get things done? I mean, we've seen some big staff changes on the 9th floor. It tells me that they were looking to change the way they've done business. That's happened. So looking forward, what do you expect?
Well, I do think that there will be changes. As Marcus talked about earlier, for the fiscal year that we're currently in, we had a $2 billion one-time surplus. That money all got spent. We're not going to have that surplus. So the dynamic of the legislature and governor's negotiations on the budget are going to change again with the increase in ESA costs. Where is that money going to come from? Right? Are you going to cut the Department of Public Safety? Are you going to cut the Department of Health Services? Are you going to kick people off of access? How are you going to solve that problem? Mm-hmm. So that's going to change the dynamic of related to the budget. But again, I think what the governor is going to focus on continuing this year, next year's session, mm-hmm. is to try and figure out ways, again, to grow the economy, grow the middle class, continue to provide services for people that need it, again, improve the outcomes in education, whether it's K-12 or higher ed, and try and move the state forward in a fashion that people want to continue to come here, dealing with the water challenges we have, dealing with, all of the issues that we have, but actually kind of, again, trying to do that in a positive manner.
And Marcus, how do you think the governor should go about getting her agenda accomplished, whatever that might be? Because next year is going to be crazy. It's going to be another election cycle. And we know how that affects every legislative session that comes on that even-numbered year. What advice would you be giving her?
Well, this budget, for those at home who don't understand, I mean, we had a completely unorthodox way of doing the budget this year, and that was we have so much money, we're going to allot X amount for a representative in the House and X amount for a senator, and you guys pick how that money gets spent. We are, and by the way, I guess that sort of greases the wheels, as they say, and probably made it the budget a little bit more accomplishable. Next year, you're not going to have that money. And there will be a lot more fighting, I think, in between the 9th floor and legislative leadership. In addition to that, it is a campaign year, so we're going to have some of those bills appealing to the base moving forward. So I expect, not far off her number of vetoes this year. I don't think there's anything that points to a different outcome for next year.
Well, on that down note, I think we're going to have to wrap up the conversation.
Well,
here. Stay tuned for more fighting next year at the legislature.
The good news is it's campaign year, so they're going to want to get out.
And yet,
maybe.
We'll not be able to.
Right, but that's a good point.
It's like, maybe? I think you got to throw all assumptions out the window. All past assumptions out the window anymore.
Dennis, I'm going under on 204 days for next session, though.
And I want documentation before next year of him on the over-under veto count. I mean, because,
Easy to say today.
Trust but verify. That's all I got to say.
There is evidence.
All right, I want to thank you both for joining us here. And that we'll have to end our conversation right there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, Colin. Hell of a week. I mean, we came into the week, we were still immersed in the longest legislative session in state history.
Yes.
We still had a Pac12 conference.
Yes. Up until 20 minutes ago, I think.
The session is now over, and it looks like the Pac-12 is going bye-bye.
Yeah. The last few days have been killing me. And I'm an Oregon grad, and of course now my school gets blamed for killing the Pac-12. when in fact there may be other culprits out there.
Don't make me say it, dude. I'm only going to get in trouble with my hot take. It wasn't Oregon. It wasn't Oregon State. It was O.J. Simpson's alma mater that you can blame for all this. They were the first ones to leave.
And clarifying, Oregon, not Oregon State. I'm not a beaver. But yeah, Oregon State now king of the Mountain West, I think.
But, boy. Oh, boy.
And I get to now root for my alma mater against, like, Indiana and Rutgers.
Yeah, I can't wait to see that. You know, the Ducks versus the Maryland Terrapins. Terrapins?
The Rutgers, whatever the hell Rutgers is. Are they some sort of knight?
Fighting accountants?
Scarlet Knights? Golden Knights?
Scarlet Accountants?
Knights in white satin? I don't know what they are.
Are they in Jersey?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they're in beautiful Jersey.
Okay. I'll save the open mic amateur hack comedy jokes for a later time.
Yeah, they're too easy.
So let's talk a little bit about the session wrapping up. What sticks out in your mind? I mean, I'm not looking for any big hot takeaways from you, Colin, but when you think back, like, what was the big moment? What sticks out to you?
Just the takeaway for me is just the endless stalemate on everything. When you have that many vetoes, it all feels like such a waste of time. And obviously, I know why there were vetoes. When you have you have a Democratic governor and you have a Republican legislature that is pretty intent on sending stuff that they know is going to get vetoed. Yeah. You're going to have a fairly ridiculous session, and that's what it felt like.
And it was like Marcus and Mike were saying earlier, and by the way, I trust Marcus was near the veto total, but I do want verification on that. But we knew going in it was going to be like that, and that wasn't much of a surprise. I mean, to me, maybe it's just recency bias, but some of the stuff that's sticking out to me are some of the tax cuts.
Yeah.
The rental tax. I know a lot of people are very skeptical about whether that's really going to save anybody. They're referring to it as like an inflation, a response to inflation. But this tax doesn't take effect until 2025. So even if you are getting the savings, which is there are legitimate questions out there whether you will be seeing savings from the rental tax from the cities that charge them. That's that was done. Marcus brought up the $250 rebate per child was no income required. Everybody who has a kid gets that $250 rebate. That kind of stuff was interesting to me, and I do think. The end of the session, they finally got that Proposition 400, that transportation tax, through. Maricopa County voters will now get a chance to, reject or accept the extension of the sales tax that was first passed in 1985. My big takeaway with that is why is there a law on the books that the legislature has to put this tax on the ballot for Maricopa County? Why can't Maricopa County just decide to put something on the ballot and the voters then can decide whether they want to be taxed or not?
Right. And they so many of the opponents have framed it like they were approving this money. And they're not. They're approving it to go back on the ballot where it's been repeatedly and always passed. So it's up to the voters regardless, and the voters have shown they're very supportive of it. It passes handily every time, and polls show it's going to pass handily this time.
And, to the unfinished business part of this whole thing, trying to rein in the ESA program. I mean, if we believe, the forecast, I mean, again, there are two forecasts, one from the Department of Education that's run by Republican Tom Horn and one from Governor Hobbs's office, Democrat, are both saying it's $1 billion. It's going to blow a hole in the current budget year. I mean, what can be done with that?
And the Republicans do not appear to be willing to budge an inch on that.
No,
and that's going to be a problem.
I was, pressing, Mike Haener a little bit on that. Like, could the governor have gotten any more leverage, by, holding off on signing the budget, maybe forcing Republicans to start entertaining some ideas, some guardrails on this program. But ultimately, I kind of think, Speaker Toma, Republicans down to they were not going to budge. No. It was a die on the hill issue for them. And, I don't know what happens next year. I don't know if there's something that could change their attitudes or their minds out there, but this is a program that is just exploding. Yeah.
And I mean, they were able to kill the automatic comparison is to the car thing, the clean air debacle.
The alt fuels.
The alt fuels. Thank you.
Yeah.
And at least in that spot, the governor was able to step in and say, this thing's dead. You can sue me if you want. It's dead. We can't do this.
Well,
the expense is too great.
Well, like they were saying, is that was a different time. You had people who said, like, look, this is a runaway spending program. We're talking about the alternative fuel stuff. Let's get together and let's fix this.
Yes.
And now, people are looking at this program and the explosive growth. Projections are out there. It's costing a lot of money. And as of right now, the people who are adding to the costs, it looks like that, a lot of them have been in private schools.
Yes.
And, weren't costing taxpayers any money. But now that has been universalized, that every child in Arizona is eligible for this ESA program, they are getting that money to send their kids to the school that they were the year before that they were paying for.
Right.
So that is adding to a lot of the costs there as well. It's a big issue that they're going to have to try to work through. And frankly, I'm skeptical, what's the political blowback too after this program is in place for a few years? How do you curb it then? Do you start repealing any of that? What's the political reality there?
Yeah, so it's a tough one to get rid of once it's in place.
Yeah, because if let's look at Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. How do you it was really unpopular with Republicans. They tried to kill it a bunch of times, but after it had been in place for so long, can you really repeal any of it?
It's a lot easier to not allow someone to get health care through this option than it is to, once they have the health care, take away their health care.
And the same with the education.
Yes.
You're going to start taking that away from people.
If you're going to force a kid to change schools because of it, that's a very different prospect.
Yeah. So I don't know what where you move forward from there. But yeah, big interesting week, historic, longest session on record, the most vetoes on record, and there we go. It's already, it's just setting up to see where we're going to be at next year. I don't think next year is going to be very easy for anyone down there, it being a contentious presidential election year.
Yeah. Next year should be a mess. It should be an absolute mess.
All right. And with that, we will sign off for now. And maybe next week we'll know if there is a Pacific
We've been calling it the two-pack now?
Yes,
because it may be down to two. Oregon State and Washington State.
Yeah, I know. It's a different world, man.
Yeah.
All right, dude.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening. You can subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, the Google Store, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. See you next time.